Welcome back. On today's episode, which as you can see I'm shooting 42 minutes after the previous video, we're going to be implementing ASP.NET Core Identity, which is going to implement our internal database authentication so that you don't need Active Directory in order to authenticate users. We can just register users and store them in the database just like any other website that users log into that you're probably familiar with. So one thing that I neglected to create on the last video was logging for the authentication. It's always a good idea if you're authenticating people to log things, at least log the failures so that you can see if your site is under attack or whatever. So in our auth resolver service, I'm going to dependency inject an iLogger of auth resolver. And I'm going to capture the instance here, and that way in our authenticate function we can do things like log trace, and I can say things such as auth started, user name at domain, and then in our authenticate with function, we can do something along the lines of, let's see. So here we definitely want to log this because this could potentially be some type of request forgery. Unknown auth provider, prov name, and this should probably be a warning. And then down here, instead of just returning this result, let's grab it and then return it. And then we can say logger dot, well, if it was successful, reslut. I wish I had a design for every time in my lifetime I've typed the word reslut. If it's successful, then we'll log one thing, otherwise we'll log something else. So this will probably be information if it was successful. It will probably be a warning if it wasn't. We don't want to log an error unless like the website's actually dying. So but we'll do auth success, and we'll put the provider name here so that we know which provider they hit. And we can say auth failed, username at prov name, and we can put the error in here, result.error. And there we go. That just gives us a brief, minimal amount of logging that you would want. So in our last video, where was it? Under authenticate with, we said, hey, if it's internal, then just return not implemented. So we're going to create a new function here called public async task auth result. It's going to need to be async because this thing makes, again, see, look, reslut, I told you. This thing makes database calls, so it's not going to be synchronous. Even if I want it to be synchronous, all the .NET functions are async for this. So we're going to say authenticate internal, and we're going to get our username and our password. And here, instead of not implemented, we're just going to do return await authenticate internal username password. And then we will put our magic in here, but for now I'm just going to return null. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we need to add some NuGet packages to the mix. Specifically, we want ASP.NET Core Identity, this one, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework. ASP.NET Core Identity Provider that uses Entity Framework Core, perfect. So let's go ahead and install this. I think that's the only NuGet that we need. The rest of the identity package is part of what? Detected package downgrade. Is it already there? Latest stable, 3.15. We don't have it. Our entity framework core is 3.1. Oh, we need to upgrade this Did they come out with this while we were making this wiki? You gotta be fucking kidding me. You gotta be fucking kidding me. First of all, do not include pre-release. This thing is pissing me off. We literally made this wiki like 3 days ago. How did all of this stuff... They came out with an update. Jesus fucking Christ. Let's make sure our website actually still works before we continue. This is part of the hassle that you have to deal with when you're working with the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of web development. You're going to write half your website on one library, and then you're going to come in one day and all your shit's going to be broken because they decided to update something. Alright, cool. So we have our NuGet package in there. So the first thing that we're going to do, or rather the next thing that we're going to do, is we're going to add some classes to represent some objects in our database. The first one's going to represent a user of our wiki, and the second one is going to represent a role. So we already talked about roles previously, like user, guest, admin, editor, whatever. But those roles were never really defined anywhere. We just ephemerally pulled them out of our ass. So with Active Directory, we're pulling them based on group memberships. And then before that, we had hard-coded them. And the user and guest roles are dynamic based on whether someone's authenticated to an account or not. Here's where we're going to actually define the role in our database. And then the other thing is, so far we've been using the ASP.NET authentication system for managing user data. We've been shoving all of our metadata into claims and just authenticating the user principal in the runtime, but now we have to actually store them in our database. So the good news is that we really don't have to do much work because we can just inherit identity user. Let's go ahead and pull this in. And for role, we just inherit identity role. And let's pull that in. And that gives us pretty much everything we need. Now, what you would want to do is anything that is not included with identity, ASP.NET Identity Core, you'd want to put in here. So in the role, I'm just going to add a couple properties like can edit and, oh my god, at least I didn't type pubic, can create, and can administer server. And these are going to define what the users in that particular role can do. As you'll see, all of the other things like the name of the role and whatnot are baked into this. Let's go in here and show you. So in here is what is included with the role class. So there's an ID, a unique ID, there's a name, and there's a normalized name, which is like a case insensitive name. It's really just the name in all uppercase. So that's that. Let me show you what's inside of identity user. Identity user inherits identity user of string, which means that it uses a string for the unique ID. And then user has a lot more in here. There's a username, whether or not two-factors enabled, how many times they failed to log in, a concurrency stamp, email, if their email was confirmed or not, if lockout is enabled for their account, when their lockout period ends, normalized email and username, password hash, and I guess phone number you get. I guess these days phone number is kind of important because everyone uses like SMS for, right here, phone number confirmed. Yeah, you know what? Fuck you. Fuck you. We're not confirming any phone numbers on this wiki. So likewise in our user class, I'm going to add some things that are not included in the default. So I'm going to add title and display name, as you may remember from our previous venture into Active Directory authentication. Jesus Christ, I need a drink. Okay, so now that we got these two created, let's go ahead and add them to our database. So our database context inherits from DB context, but we're going to change this to identity DB context. And this is going to require us to include Microsoft.isp.net core.identity.entityFramework core. And this has a couple type arguments. The first one is the type of user that you're going to use in your database. So we called ours user. The second one is the type of role that you're going to use in your database, and we're going to use role. And then there's a third one. I don't think you have to provide it, but it's the type that's used for the unique identifier, the user ID and the role ID. So we're going to use string. So we're going to go ahead and save that, and that looks good. And then in our startup class, somewhere in here, let's do it right after we add our DB context. We're going to do services.addIdentity. And this is going to take some type parameters, but as usual, there we go. It also wants to know the type of user and the type of role that we're going to use in our application. By default, it uses identity user and identity role, but we want to extend upon that, so that's why we're going to use user and role. And from there, we're going to add default token providers. So what this does is, like, think about when you forget your password or something along those lines. There's a token that gets created that is a unique identifier that is used to confirm, like someone's email address or whatever. So that's what that is. Actually, let's hover over it and see what it says. Adds the default token providers used to generate tokens for reset passwords, change email, and change telephone number operations, and for two-factor authentication token generation. So it's really just a glorified random number generator. And then we're going to add entity core framework stores. And this is where we're going to tell it what database we want it to put our shit in. And we want it to go into our database. So let's go ahead and run this and make sure that everything works properly. And I can tell you that it's not going to right off the bat. And I'll show you why. I don't think it will. And I'll show you why. So when this loads up, if we go ahead and try to log in with our authentication that we used last time, notice how it's all broken now. We added this service, and suddenly our fucking authentication is broken. Why is that? Well, the reason for that is because among all of the millions of things that add identity actually does, it changes our default authentication provider, our default authentication scheme. So we're actually going to go down to here, and we're going to change this. So we're going to add some specific options here real quick. So we're going to say that the default authentication scheme is Wiki Auth. The default scheme is Wiki Auth. And then over in our authentication service, up here in our static class, when we log someone in, instead of just signing them in with a principal, we're going to provide the, if you take a look at the function, you can provide the scheme, and we're going to say Wiki Auth. And then also we're doing that under implicit login as well. So here, Wiki Auth. And I think we already got the logout correct. Yeah, the logout works correct. So let's go ahead and try this now. And hopefully that resolves it so we can move forward with our lives. Thanks, Microsoft, for fucking everything up. So Bob, and there we go. Bob is logged in, log out, and if I go back to account, my implicit login should work, and it does. Perfect. So now let's go back and actually put this shit in our database. So if I go into my package manager console, let's add a migration. We'll call it identity. So it should create a migration, blah, 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 blah. So you can see that it is creating a table called ASP.NET roles. It's also creating a table called ASP.NET users and a table called ASP.NET claims, ASP.NET user claims, all this other shit. Now, I don't know why it's altering the slug column. Why is it? Oh, because we added max length last time, and it's really smart. If you remember in episode, I think 1, we added the max length requirement to the slug property. And because .NET knows that it's never going to be more than 100 characters, it's limiting the size of the database column. So that's actually fine. That shouldn't cause any issues. So let's go ahead and update our database. And it is done. It succeeded. And so if I go in here and I refresh the tables, you can see here's all the tables that got created. And if I take a look at the columns under users, not only does it have all the columns that .NET wants it to have, but it also has title and display name. And likewise, if I go into roles and I look at the columns, it also has these can edit, can create, can administer server that we created. So now our database is up to speed. And before we do anything, we're going to have to create a page where users can register, because we can't really authenticate or test authentication out until we have a user in the database, and I'm not going to sit here and figure out what format all this shit is in. So let's go ahead and create our register page. So we're going to add a razor page. We're going to call it register. And we're going to have a couple things we're going to need in here. So the first thing is going to be the username. And let's copy this. And we're going to need an email address. We're going to need a password. We should ask the user to confirm their password. Now, by the way, a quick little rant. The reason why forms and websites and applications have always asked you to confirm your password is because you can't see it on the screen. And they want to make sure that you get it right, because if you don't get it right, you're not going to know your password to log back in. I really hate it when websites also make you confirm your email address. You can see your email address as you're fucking typing it. And if you get it wrong, you'll know because you won't be able to verify or confirm your email address. And typically you can just go in, log in with your password, and change it. I feel like a lot of websites get the whole reason for confirming things wrong. Anyway, so let's do bind property. And these are going to be required as well. Maybe if I could spell. Let's go ahead and add the annotations namespace, and let's shove these on each of these here. So blah, 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 blah. And then we're also going to want a error message in case there's an error. And then we're also going to want to create a post handler. So iasync result on post. And this is going to need to be async, so this is going to be a task of iasync result. And then let's go ahead and create our actual page here. Now, one thing that I'll bring up real quick as soon as I type my method, my form here. Someone in the comments for episode 1 said that I should be using HTML helpers to create the forms, to create the form elements. So if you don't know what an HTML helper is, it's this. You can do HTML dot, and then you can create a text box like this. You can do like text box, and this will actually create the HTML for you so that you don't have to type HTML. And like, let's say I wanted to create the username box. So the first value here is the expression that I'm binding it to. So this is the property name that I'm going to bind it to. And then the next value is the value, but we want it to be blank. So it's going to be blank. And then the next one is going to be the format of it, which I don't care about. But you can also specify HTML attributes. So if I wanted a specific class like input control, I would provide an anonymous object here, and then I would do something like class equals form control. And this looks fucking horrible. This is old school. The reason why they created tag helpers, so let's use what it should look like now. The reason they created tag helpers was so that web developers didn't have to weave in and out of C# code. And on top of that, there's a couple problems with, obviously you can't use the word class in C#, so you have to prefix it with the @ sign. But in addition to that, like, notice how when I type this ASP4 tag here, I get autocomplete. I type, a couple characters and I can tab in. And the same thing with the CSS class. All I have to do is start typing, and look, here's everything that Bootstrap supports. I don't have to guess. But when you're using an HTML helper, these are just strings. When I go here and I start typing, there's no autocomplete. If I get this wrong, that's wasted time. Same thing over here. There's absolutely no autocomplete or IntelliSense because it doesn't know that this is supposed to be a CSS class. On top of that, if I want to add additional attributes to this, as I want to, because I want like placeholder to say, enter a username or something, this is going to wind up taking more space. Look at that. It's already longer than it would have been if I just did it in straight HTML. So no, this doesn't really help. And I still have to create the label. Like if I wanted to do that through an HTML helper, I'd still have to use an HTML.label helper. So don't do that. They created tag helpers for a reason. It looks so much more beautiful to simply, type it in straight HTML. I do need to put a div around these. Not a dib, a div. For form group, because I want my Bootstrap form to look pretty. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. And I'm gonna copy this a couple times, and this one's gonna be email. Your email address. This one's gonna be password. This is gonna be a password field. Enter a secure password. This is going to be confirm your password. This is going to be password confirm. Password confirm. This should also be a password. And then down here, there should be a, oh, you know what? I also need to add. Oh, no, I did that. Perfect. And then down here, I just need to add a button. So button class, button primary. We're going to call this register. Maybe we'll put an exclamation point. No, we won't. That's really cringy. And then at the top here, we want to put our error message. So if you remember in our last video, we created these view components. So I can just say error. Text equals model.error, and now I have an error message. If I want, I can even shorten it further like that, and let's just say create account. Cool beans. Let's take a look at what this form looks like before we go any further. What did I do wrong? Oh, I gotta do something here. Oh, come on, what? Page result does not contain definition for get a waiter. Get a waiter. Get a waiter. Get a waiter. I don't want a waiter, I want a waitress. What happened here? Dun dun dun. Can I not just return the page? Can I not just return the page? What am I doing wrong? Am I missing a cast? Why can't I convert page result to iasync? Oh, this should be iAction result. Durr. I told you I didn't want a waiter. I wanted a waitress. And now that actually probably should. Whatever. Who gives a shit? Just load the fucking markup, please. There we go. That's pretty fucking pretty. Notice that password confirm just says password confirm. So one way that we can fix this is, well, there's a couple ways that we can fix this. One of them would just be just to type here, password, confirm password. And that's honestly what I would prefer to do, but let me just show you the other way of doing it, which would be to shove yet another attribute here called display name. There, and that should properly show the right thing now. Nope, there we go. So perfect. So we got all that, and I did not, yeah, I didn't hook that in, and there we go. Why did it give me a 400 the first time? Why did it give me a 400 the first time? That's so fucking weird. And there wasn't any error. Okay, whatever. Let's just ignore that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to validate our model state. So if model state is not valid, then we're going to return the page, and we can say error equals model state dot get errors, because we created that extension method in our last video. So that should handle anyone not filling in any information that they need to fill in. The next thing, what? Oh, that's not a function name. The next thing that we want to do is we want to confirm that the passwords match. So if password is not equal password confirm, then error equals the password you entered does not match. The passwords you entered do not match. And then we should probably make sure that we have a valid email address. So I'll say if not email is valid email. And we'll create a function in a second. We'll say invalid email address. So let's go into our extensions here and create a public static bool is valid email, this string email. And for now, we'll just say return email contains an @. Deal with that later. There's all kinds of regular expressions you can use to check to make sure an email address is valid. It all really depends on whether or not you want to maintain a list of the most up-to-date top-level domains or not. If you don't, then pretty much all you're really looking for is character validity. So this actually is not that out of place for what most websites do, honestly. Because if it's not valid, you're not going to get the confirmation email, so it doesn't really have to be terribly thorough. And then finally, if we can get to this point, then we want to register the user. Alright, so now at this point we're going to need to actually create the user account. So we're going to use some dependency injection as usual. I did not type that. And in our constructor, we're going to pass in a couple things. We're going to inject a user manager of user. And this is how we're going to work with the database to create accounts, set up roles, validate passwords, do all that good shit. And I'm also going to grab a logger of register model so that we can log some things. And as usual, we're going to create some private fields here that reference these. So call that the user manager, and call this the iLogger logger. And then we'll go ahead and set these up. What? I hate it when errors show up on the screen and they disappear before I can even, just fucking stupid delays. Anyway, user manager logger is logger. Cool. So now down here, we're going to create a user object. So we're going to say user is new user. So this is the class that we created for our user object in the database. I'm going to say username equals username and email equals email. And if this looks kind of weird, email equals email, C# is smart enough to know that if you look here, this is identityuser.email equals registermodel.email. It's not so stupid as to set the same thing to itself. It knows what I'm talking about. So now we're going to do, we're going to call something called usermanager.createAsync, and this is going to create a user. And there's two overloads. I can either create a user with no password, which is helpful if I'm making an application where we don't use passwords, like let's say we use certificates or two-factor auth or whatever the fuck. Maybe it's like Telegram and it only uses a phone number. Or we can create it with the password. So we're going to pass our user object in there, and we're going to pass the password in as well. And then we're going to say if the result succeeded, then that means registration was okay. And otherwise, it failed. So we're going to want to populate our error. So the error in the result actually comes in this form of, it's a collection of identity errors. So we actually have to, first of all, we want to grab the description out of them. There's a code and a description. I don't know why you would want the code, maybe for logging purposes. And then we're going to join them together with a new line, since there could potentially be multiple errors, as you'll see in a minute. And we're going to keep them on the same page if their registration fails. Now, if their registration was okay, there's a couple things we want to do here. The first thing we want to do is we want to, you know what, but let's not even do that yet. Let's just go ahead and sign them in. So what we want to do is we want to call auth.login, and this is going to take HTTP context, and it's going to take an auth result. So we're gonna want to craft that, and this is also async, so we need to await it. So let's go ahead and create auth result, new auth result. And here we're going to say the username is the username. Actually, I think I can just say username, the email address, and I think that's all we really grabbed for them. But we do need to say auth type is internal database. Does this not work? I can't do that? Fine. Username is username, email is email, blah, 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 blah. And then we'll run the login function, which should apply their identity to the current session. And then we will return redirect to page, and we'll send them over to /account. Now, the one thing that we haven't done is we haven't added the user role to them. Actually, we could go in here and say roles equals. Actually, you know what? The login function is actually going to add the user role to them, so we're fine. But we haven't added the user role to them in the database. And arguably, you could say, well, you don't need to because you're always going to tack the user role on there. But I do want to show you what it looks like to add a role to a user. But we can't do it yet because there's no roles in the database. So let's just go ahead and test this out and see what this gives us. So let's go over here to /register. And I don't want to use Bob because Bob is already in the directory. So let's use someone else. Let's say Mario. Let's say Mario at example.net. And let's just put a shitty password in there. Well, first of all, if we forget one of these fields, obviously we're going to get... Why does that keep happening? I want to know why that keeps happening. We're going to say blah, blah, blah. Let's just forget one of the fields. You can see that it gets upset that the confirm, the password confirm is not there. But if I go ahead and fill it in, we get all these errors because out of the box, ASP.NET Core Identity has strict password control. Now I'll show you how to change that, but for now I'm just going to put a secure password in here. And let's go ahead and create Mario. And what did we do wrong? For each role in our roles. Oh no, it's not expecting roles to be blank. That's okay. That's okay. So let's go into our, not that, let's go into our login function here. And we'll just guard this with if our dot roles is not null. There we go. That should solve that. So while that recompiles, let's go ahead and look in our database. So it did create a user called Mario. Whoa! It did create a user called Mario. And you can see here what it looks like. There's his username. His normalized username is just his name capitalized. There's the email address. Email has not been confirmed. And then there's a password hash. And then there's a what's called a security stamp. I can only gather that this is the salt for the password hash. And then there's a bunch of other shit that we didn't fill in. So let's just go back here and do this again. Let's say Mario 2 this time. And let's put a secure password in here. Register. And there we go. Mario is logged in. And you can see that the auth method is showing internal database. There's his IP, blah, 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 blah. And he has the user role because we hard-coded the user role in the login method. But we still need to add that to the database. If I go into the database and refresh, you can see that here's Mario 2. Now, I did use the same password for both of those, for both accounts. So you can see that the password hash is different. And the reason for that is that they're most likely salting it with the security stamp. So what that means is that they're taking a hash. It's probably a SHA-1 or a SHA-256 hash. Honestly, it's probably a SHA-256 hash, knowing them. They're not only taking a SHA hash of the password, but then they're generating this pseudo-random security stamp called the salt, and they're appending it to the hash of the password, and then they're hashing it again to get the real password hash. So that actually helps in two ways. Number one, it means that I can't just take a rainbow table and look these values up. Like I can't just Google this. If this is a common password or just like a regular word, I can't just Google this and find out what it is. There's no rainbow table for this because they're salted. And this is different every time, so there's no reasonable way that someone is going to have a pre-made table of hashes that will let me reverse this. And the other benefit is that even without a rainbow table, if they didn't salt the password hash, I could tell that two different users had the same password. But here I can't. Even though these two users have the same password, their password hash is relatively different. So anyway, there's a roles table over here that we want to add some roles into. I want to add the user, admin, and editor roles. Now, typically you'd create a user interface for this. I'm going out of my way to not use the built-in UI pages that ASP.NET uses because number one, they're fugly. Number two, they don't meet my needs. We're going to have all kinds of other doohickeys in there to manage permissions and whatever that I don't want to use their stuff. And number three, it's in a different NuGet package that we don't need. But for now, I'm just going to manually add roles into the database table. So before I do that, I'm going to do a quick little hack here. And this isn't going to really change the database at all, but I am going to go into this ID field and set a default value of new ID so that I don't have to type a GUID in every time I want to create a role. So now I can edit this table, and I can say we got a role called user, and the normalized name is capital user. And yes, users can edit. Yes, users can create. No, they're not an administrator. What happened? Did I not save that? I did not save that. There we go. Now I should be able to do that. And then we're going to create, let's do editor next. Editor. They can edit. They can create. They can administer. Come on. And then an admin is an admin, and yes they can, yes they can, yes they can, true, 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 like that Spandau Ballet song. And now I can take this user role ID and let's manually apply it to these two users. So I'm going to go into the user roles table and I'm going to shove that in there. And I'm going to grab their user ID from here. Mario2 is first. Shove that in there. Boom. I'm going to copy that, put that there. Grab Mario1. And if we had Luigi, I would do him next, but we don't need to. So there we go. Now in the database, they all have the user role. But more importantly, the user role exists. So in my registration logic over here, registration, okay. The first thing I can do before I actually sign them in, and I'm going to put this in a try catch, and I'll explain why in a second. I'm going to say await user manager add to role. I'm going to pass in the user. I'm going to say user. And now any user that I create from now on is going to get that user role automatically. Now, why did I put it in a try catch with absolutely no error handling? The reason for this is that once we create the user in the database, I don't want some stupid error in this to result in them getting a 500 internal server error page. Because what's going to happen is they're going to get a user that's half created. They're going to wind up with Mario 1, Mario whatever, and they're going to get like a 500 error page, and they're going to think it didn't go through, and then they're going to go back, and they're going to try to create it again. It's going to tell them that the user already exists in the database because they never actually got redirected and signed in. So if this can't happen, I don't care. If someone deletes the user role later on, I don't care. It's going to get added back anyway. So this just kind of makes sure that we don't wind up with a half-created user. I mean, we will wind up with a half-created user, but the user experience will be better. Now, obviously, if this was some important, if this was some important function where I was going to add like two-factor authentication to their account and we failed, then I could go in and delete the user that we just created. But rather than rolling back, essentially the theoretical transaction, I'm just going to do that for fucking now. So let's just go ahead and run this one more time just to show you that if I create another user, it will have the user role automatically. And just to make sure that my code is not bullshit. So let's do this. And I guess this time let's create Luigi. And Luigi at example.net. I will show you real quick that if I do try to create another Mario, it will, oh my god, why does this happen? I want to know why that happens. I think it might have something to do with the cross-request forgery token, but we'll take a look at that in a second. But what I did want to show you is that if I try to create one, I don't have to do a check to see if the account is already in the database. It's already going to happen. ASP.NET Core is already going to do that check for me. There we go. Luigi's logged in, and he was a user before. But more importantly, if I refresh this table, there we go. There's a third quid, and he is a user, so we're great. Okay, now watch this. As soon as this page loads, I'm going to hit F12. And I'm going to go to register before the initial page starts loading. And I'm going to type in, whatever, foo at example.net. Now, to the people that are going to tell me that I'm getting this 400 error because I'm missing the request forgery token, let me show you something here. Here's the call that is resulting in the 400 error. And if you scroll down and you look at the form data, you can see that the request verification token is in there. It is getting posted. It is part of the form. And I verified this by viewing the source. What seems to be happening is that if I load this page as fast as I fucking can, as I normally do in these videos, the request verification token that is generated does not seem to be the one that ASP.NET Core wants to validate against. if I wait for the initial welcome page to finish loading and then I go to the register page, this does not happen. If I refresh this page right now and then log in, no matter what I do, it will work. So just FYI, I don't know if this is a bug or if this is something along those lines, but I will show you that if I view the source here, there is a request verification token. It is not being omitted. It is being inserted by ASP.NET Core, and this form does work if I just wait a fucking second. So if you know why this is happening, comment down below, but don't tell me that I forgot the token. It's fucking here. Now, let's get on with the show. Okay, so now let's create the sign-in code that we need in order to log in with these accounts that we've been creating. So we're going to go back to our auth.cs, and I'm going to find that function that I wrote earlier called authenticate internal, which is right here. It's all stubbed out. And we're going to do some interesting shit here. But first, we do need to get a user manager. So up here in the auth resolver service, I'm going to create a private field to track a user manager of user. And as usual, we'll call it user manager. Going to go ahead and pull in the namespace. And then I'm going to go ahead and inject it into my sequence of injections here. User manager of user, user manager, user manager equals user manager. And I do need to make this a lowercase u. And then now down here, we can say var user equals await user manager get user async. No, I don't want get user async. I want find by name async. And this is going to take a username, which it does. And we'll say if the user is not null, then we found the user. If the user is null, then we're going to return new auth result invalid username or password. Like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to tip the user off as to whether it's their username or their password that's wrong, because if they can guess that something's a valid username, then you want to be as vague as possible here, because if you give a different error for unknown user than you do for incorrect password, then people can, you know, go in and at least identify that a username does exist. And if it's a username that they think might be privileged, then at that point, then the next step is to just brute force the password. If they can't tell if the username or the password is valid, then that's a much bigger namespace that they have to brute force against. So, but we are going to log that. Let's log. Should it be a warning? I don't think it should be a warning. I think it should just be information. And just say internal auth failed, unknown user, username. Awesome. Now, if the user does exist, the next thing we want to do is check their password. So we're going to do result equals await user manager dot check password async. And we're going to provide the user object and the password. And this just returns a Boolean. So at this point, we can say if not result, then the password's incorrect. So let's just go ahead and copy this and invalid username password. And we can say incorrect password for username. Now, if we get to this point, username and password are valid. And we want to get the roles that are associated with their account. So we'll do await user manager dot get roles async, pass in the user, and let's convert this to an array because we're going to need it in that format for our auth results. And then we're going to go ahead and create a, let's just return it straight away, return new auth result. And then we'll populate this. So username is user.username. That should be a comma. Auth type is internal database. Success is true. email equals user.email, title equals user.title, display name equals user.display name, roles equals the roles array that we just grabbed. And actually, I think that's all we need. So that should work. And we shouldn't have to change anything on our login page because this just simply extends the Auth resolver service that we created in the last video. So let's go ahead and see if we can log in with one of these bullshit Mario Luigi accounts that we created. And I'll be sure to wait for the welcome page to fucking load first. And then let's just try Luigi. And then I'll put in Luigi's special password and we'll say internal. And what the fuck did we do wrong here? Object represents the instances of an object. Oh, did I not set the user manager? I thought I set the user manager. Oh, you know what? I set the user manager to itself. Oops. Oops. I knew there was going to be a problem when I scrolled that off the screen before the squiggly went away. I fucking knew it. Fucking knew it. Alright, so one more time. Luigi, special password, internal, and we're in. Internal database, there's the email address Luigi's registered with, and there's our roles. And one thing we might want to fix is that the user role got added twice, once from the database and once from the login function. So we might want to clean that up, but it works. So now one thing we want to check here, now that we have two different modes of authentication going, is I'm going to go into my app settings.json and I'm going to change authentication selectable to be false, which if you remember, this is going to, I did not turn on fucking speech recognition, you cunt. If you remember, this is going to put it into cascade mode. So if I refresh the page here, the domain selector goes away. And if I go ahead and I log in with Luigi again, it should work, and it does. But on the same exact form, if I log in with a Active Directory account, you can see that it automatically determines which domain it came from. And here's the Active Directory DN. And, you know, just to show you, I'll log in with a different one. Boom. You can see exactly why you might want to use the cascading mode. If we look in the log, you'll see that when I logged in with Luigi, it first tried the DERMS domain, and Luigi's not there. It tried the other domain, and Luigi wasn't there. And then it successfully logged in as Luigi on the internal database. Now it seems like we're not logging that fact, so let's go ahead and fix some things real quick. First thing I want to do is add in authenticate internal that we actually did authenticate successfully. Successful authentication. Let's just say successful internal database auth username. So that's getting logged. And then the other thing I want to do is in our login function, we want to only add the user role if it's not already there. So here, where we say that we're going to add the user role, pretty much what we'll do is I could do a lookup into the roles list and do like a where clause, but we're already enumerating it, presumably. So what I will do is I will say if the roles weren't declared, then add user. And if the roles were declared, we'll say bool user exists equals false, and then if role dot to, actually I think to upper is the more internationally accepted way of invarianting. Actually I think you should do to upper invariant, but it doesn't fucking matter. Is user, then we want to say user exists equals true. Actually, one way to make this shorter would be to just say user exists or equals that. And then that way, when we get down to here, we could say, you know what, actually, let's make this even simpler and just put that up there, and then get rid of this and just say, if not, user exists. Except I don't want to call it user exists because that makes it sound like the user doesn't exist in the database. So I'm going to say user role claim user has user role. There we go. That makes more sense. So now if I authenticate using the built-in database, I should only have one role called user. Not that it matters, because no one's going to see this, and the isInRole function in .NET's just going to find the first one. But you know, just to make it pretty, add a couple extra. Oops, that's not the right password. You can see here that, you know, the validation properly works, and there's only one user account, so awesome sauce. So that takes us to the end of the video. I'm going to go ahead and check in my code here. Say part 4 ASP.NET Core Identity Database Auth. And as always, if you can figure out why I'm getting that fucking 400 bad request, comment below. Otherwise, if you like the video and you want to see more, like, subscribe, consider supporting me on Patreon. My voice is almost kaput after doing this for a couple hours. So I will see you, and as always, stay safe.